This is the ER channel, Empires and Revolution. And this is a follow-up to my previous video about the American War of Independence, in which I said it was merely a sideshow in a bigger conflict that was mainly between Britain and France. Now, the key battle in the so-called American War of Independence, which was of course merely part of a bigger Anglo-French conflict, was the Battle of Yorkton, which occurred between September the 28th and October the 19th. Now, this site is called the American Battlefield Trust, and as you can see, they've got Yorkton down as an American victory. British casualties 8,589. American casualties 389. What kind of supermen are these Americans? And they've also provided a quite a detailed map of the battlefield. And we can zoom in and we can see that here we have the French forces and here we have the American forces. So wait a minute, I thought this was an American victory. This is one of the great lies of American history, the idea that the Americans fought and won the American War of Independence, and that it was merely a struggle between America and Britain. The truth is, it was part of a much bigger struggle, and in that struggle America played a relatively minor or even subservient role. And this can be demonstrated most effectively by looking at the so-called decisive victory of the war, which was this Battle of Yorkton. Now, if we go to Wikipedia, we can look at the Yorkton campaign. And first of all, we can focus on the respective strengths of the two sides involved. And we can see here American land forces 5,500 men and 60 cannon. French forces, French land forces 9,500 and 90 cannon. French Navy 36 ships of the line and 22,000 personnel. So it looks like there were 6 times as many Frenchmen involved in this American victory as Americans. Now, most people who are interested in history already know the basics of the Battle of Yorkton. The army of Cornwallis was roaming around the southern part of the United States, North Carolina, Virginia. There were a few battles, mostly indecisive, and eventually Cornwallis came to Yorkton, where he was expecting to be reinforced or to be taken by ship to some other location from where he could continue the war. The French fleet then came up and established naval dominance, cutting him off from supplies, landing more troops, and with a 2-to-1 superiority and his back to the sea, which was controlled by the French, he was pushed into a position where he decided to negotiate surrender terms. Americans still manage, by and large, to pass this off as a great American victory. There's a number of ways in which they do this. One way is not to focus too much on the naval dimension, that can be passed over, ignored, and instead we can focus on the actual Siege of Yorkton, where a Franco-American force besieged Cornwallis's army and forced it to surrender. It can also be pointed out that the commander-in-chief was George Washington, and so it was essentially an American victory with a bit of French help. This is highly erroneous. First of all, if we look at the brains behind Yorkton, it really wasn't Washington. Washington was, generally speaking, a rather mediocre military man. He wasn't really too bright. He was more of a kind of dogged type. And I think that the credit for the battle plan for Yorkton must go to this man, the Comte de Rochambeau, a professional French soldier. Now, this view can be supported by a brief look at Wikipedia. Here we see that Washington favoured the idea of attacking New York, while Rochambeau favoured action in Virginia, where the British were less well established. Now, Rochambeau was a very diplomatic and subtle operator, and he kind of allowed Washington to think he was in charge while dropping ideas into his head. The result of this was that Washington eventually came around to Rochambeau's way of thinking and took his cues from the French general. Now, I'm not going to get into all the kind of geeky detail, but eventually what happened was that the French and the Americans and the French Navy managed to surround Cornwallis at Yorkton. And then it was very much a question of whether the British Navy could come and lend its support or not. As is quite well known, the British failed to break through the French fleet, which meant that Cornwallis could not receive supplies and reinforcements, following which it was really down to the siege. And the decisive factor in the siege was, of course, artillery. This was essentially an artillery battle. There were, of course, some infantry engagements. There were a couple of fortified positions that were stormed, etc. But by and large, it was all about artillery. So, did the American colonial militias that made up the bulk of the Continental Army have top-of-the-range artillery equipment, or did the highly professional French army have that equipment? I think we know the answer to that question. Now, the French artillery was much better than the American artillery. They had better guns, they had highly trained artillerymen, they knew what they were doing when it came to artillery. The Americans also had artillery, but it wasn't of the same caliber as the French artillery, and probably most of the American guns were supplied by the French anyway, and the American gunners were probably trained by the French gunners to some degree, or even a considerable degree. Now, there's this article, which is from the Chicago Tribune, and it says, "The big guns open up in the Yorkton siege that won America's independence." And of course, it shows you a picture of one of the guns, which is still on display at the Yorkton Historical Battlefield. And I just wonder where this was made. Let's have a look. It's one of the French 24-pound cannon. Now, this article, which dates from 2016, states, "By far the biggest and possibly Definitely, I think. Best wielded were the weapons manned by the French army, which, in the initial stages of the siege, trained 12 24-pound and 8 16-pound field guns on the British lines from their Grand Battery alone. On the American side of the line, the largest pieces included 3 24-pounders and 3 18-pounders. So right there we can see the disparity in French artillery. They have 12 24-pounders, and American artillery, they only have 3 24-pounders. Now this describes the initial artillery deployment. This was then supplemented with additional guns from the French fleet. So more guns arrived, and these guns were all French guns, presumably manned mainly by French artillerymen. After that, it was very much a case of pummeling the British army into submission. And finally, that led to the surrender at Yorkton, which of course was the climatic battle in this particular part of the war. Now, the Battle of Yorkton, the so-called decisive battle, happened in 1781, but it couldn't have been that decisive in the greater conflict, which was the global Anglo-French War, because that ended 2 years later. And as I said in my previous video, the reason that ended was because the French and their allies, the Spanish and the Dutch, were attacking Britain at several different points. At Gibraltar, there was a threatened invasion of England, and of course in the West Indies, which were of great economic importance at that time, much more than the North American continent, believe it or not. So there we have it. The American War of Independence was a theatre of a greater war, and the decisive battle in that theatre, the Siege of Yorkton, was actually overwhelmingly, I would say 3/4, a French victory.